Greetings, everybody. My name is Sophia Morgan, and I am here today with Mr. Clement Branche, who is the academic director of the PhD Organizational Behavior Program at the University of the West Indies, Mona. I am a finalizing student. I'm about to submit my thesis. It's been a long journey. And I am just here today chatting, having a conversation with our director about the program. So, reflective conversation really about how the program has been developing and emerging over time. And we want to talk, about some concepts. We want to discuss some of the areas that we're studying in the program, and we would like Mr. Branche to elaborate on these areas for us. We have also with us in this conversation some very interesting or interested students who would, just curious about our program and would like to share in the discussion as you so please. So welcome. So, Mr. Branche, tell us about the PhD program. Tell us about the extent to which the program possess and provide an intellectual direction and perspective in our Caribbean society.
Okay, the program does provide a quite distinctive intellectual perspective, and that is established across 5 areas. So I will simply note the 5 areas out of which this direction has emerged and developed. Number 1, the program is about recentering and reinvigorating Caribbean organizational theory. But that is done within what we call a psycho-sociocultural theoretical framework, and with attention to the whole range of organizations from the micro to the large. Okay. So that's the first thing. We're trying to recenter and to reinvigorate Caribbean organizational analysis. And we're doing that within a psycho-sociocultural framework, and with attention to small organizations, micro organizations, private, public, large, medium-sized organizations.
Okay. So explain this concept of the psycho-sociocultural. I know for the most part we are aware of a sociocultural framework, and so this notion of a psycho-sociocultural, especially within an organizational behavior, how does that fit within organizational behavior? Why a psycho-sociocultural framework?
Right, so we're going to come to that because we have selected 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have selected 8 conceptual areas that we wanted to emphasize. And everybody who has come through the program, especially the more recent students, would be able to identify these 8 areas and elaborate on them in doing their research on Caribbean organization. So just to mention the 8 areas first, and we'll come back to discussing them in them, right? So the psycho-sociocultural is 1. Secondly, the plural Creole complex is 2. Thirdly, individualization is 3. Fourth is the concept of a working identity. 5 is forms of informality. 6 is emotional power. And 7 is the concept of emotional losses, and related to that, the concept of emotional gains. So those are the 8 distinctive conceptual areas that we're pulling together in presenting our framework. We will come back to discussing them. So in addition to the recentering and the reinvigoration of Caribbean organizational analysis, our second thing that we emphasize is a mixed method approach to pure, applied, and intervention research, so that we're not just developing theory, but we're making clear methodological commitments. And this program emphasizes the mixed method approach to methodology, and also that methodology might be focused in terms of pure, mixed, pure applied, and or intervention approaches. The third thing that we're doing is giving attention to Caribbean historical and developmental dynamics, relating a plural Creole complex perspective and a post-colonial perspective. So if you say, what are the 2 broad theoretical frameworks that you're working with and bringing together? The 2 broad theoretical frameworks would be, on the one hand, the plural Creole complex, and secondly, the post-colonial perspective. The fourth thing that we're doing is integrating social psychology and sociology. And we're doing this given the importance of emotional and identity dynamics in social life. Even before we emphasize the importance of this in a Caribbean environment, so that our fourth message is that we are developing perspectives that integrate social psychology and sociology, and in doing that, we're paying attention to emotions and identity. And the fifth thing we're doing is specifying the whole range of concepts that we mentioned.
Okay.
So those 8 concepts that we mentioned earlier, we are specifying, elaborating, and applying those concepts in our analysis. So that is where the direction is. That is, so you have the bones, the bare bones of the framework within which we want our students to work and to develop the analysis of Caribbean organizations.
Well, this is a very interesting synopsis of the program, and I'm laughing because as I'm listening to all these 5 things, my study in a way captures all of these things. The mixed methods, I'm looking at identities in a post-colonial organization. So when you talk about the concept of the working identity and the post-colonial, as I was even thinking of the post-colonial and the Creole, bringing that concept, bringing those concepts together, I would say that all of our studies, as I'm even thinking of some of the studies of my colleagues, all of them have really captured what these 5 things are and brought them together. So I think we're doing good. We're at a good place in our program moving forward as we're emerging, since this is about developing and emerging. So, are we going to elaborate now on the concepts? Are we going to talk about?
Right, we can talk a bit about the 8 concepts that you mentioned. I think the first one is the plural Creole perspective or complex. And you would notice that in Caribbean social theory, some people are identified as being of the pluralist persuasion, and some people are identified as being of the Creole society persuasion. We don't see any necessary conflict between the two, because creolization is about bringing diversities together. So that you have to have pluralism in order to have creolization. You have to have distinctive diversities that you then creolize by bringing them together. And although we're not arguing for the existence entirely of plural societies, there certainly are dimensions of pluralism or pluralist enclaves within different Caribbean societies. So that we are saying that in Caribbean societies, you are engaged with questions of difference and also with questions of integration, emerging out of these differences. So that is our position. Our position is to carry forward both the analysis of pluralism,
and
divergences and differences, and the analysis of accommodation and acculturation, which is the Creole process. Right? So our perspective draws on both the pluralist tradition and the Creole society tradition. And it further brings that in relation to a larger perspective dealing with post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is important for us in 3 fundamental ways. It is important. One is that the post-colonial perspective takes a much broader spectrum of social theories and brings them together. So that we feel you should include, in talking about Caribbean society, you should include literary theories, you should include Caribbean poetics, right? As a sociology, as a history, as a politics. So that post-colonialism is about a wide range of social theory and articulating that wide range of social theory. So that's one. Secondly, post-colonialism is also about emphasizing the emotional dynamics of life, because the colonial perspective is not just about structuring social relations. The colonial perspective fundamentally is about structuring identities, structuring notions of the self.
And so this is
so
why
that there is. So what colonialism achieved is the other within.
Right.
So that there is a persistent psychological drama and dynamic that is part of the colonial and post-colonial perspective that we have to deal with. So that's the second reason why we
obviously
we are post-colonial.
because I'm thinking of Fanon's work
Right, Fanan would be a
When-
very
when-
good example.
Right. When we think about the emotional content, about how we understand, or struggles as a Caribbean people from a post-colonial perspective, I think Fanan is excellent at helping us to understand that emotional content. So, the third one.
Right, and the third aspect of the post-colonial that we are concerned with, and one of the reasons why we work within the perspective, is that post-colonialism is about seeing the past and the present, the way in which relationships established a very long time ago don't simply wither and die, but they have a continued existence at a different point in time. So that it's called post-colonial, but it only means a different stage of the colonial struggle, if you understand. Because those past and foundational relationships still exist in the world today, and they're still carried forward in Caribbean social relations.
Because broad definitions of post-colonial involve looking at it from the perspective of after colonial, so post as in after colonialism, and people who look at it like that look at the legacies of colonialism, the impact of colonialism on societies today. So there's a big argument as about whether all societies that were once colonized are post-colonial societies. A broad answer is not necessarily. If a society is still grappling expressively to deal with these legacies, they bear more this label of a post-colonial society. So there's a lot of definitions and ways of seeing and viewing and defining post-colonialism, which makes the whole thing a little tricky.
And however you define it, there are two things that are important. Right? As you say, one is that the structures of power that establish colonial relationships still exist in many parts of the large world. So power doesn't simply change or disappear. So those power relationships between the metropole and the third world, if you like, still exist. They still have to be dealt with today. And the other thing that we can agree on is that post-colonial at least indicate a level of consciousness where there's a recognition that we have to live with these legacies, but use these legacies in ways that are more emancipatory rather than oppressive. So this is part of what the post-colonial indicates. Okay. Right, so we try to bring together the post-colonial and the plural Creole complex as broad theories that we are working with. We also, as you know, we also use the notion of individualization. But the concept of individualization is an interesting concept because in modern cosmopolitan theorizing, individualization is an important concept. Okay? You also find the notion of individualization.
How would you define it for?
Yes. So I have a nice definition that I'll give you, but before I get to the definition, that in Ericksonian identity theory, there's also a lot of attention on the process of individualization. And the argument is that in the construction of identity in late modern societies, there is a loss of the anchors of assured authoritative social groups that have existed in the past, so that the individual is thrown back on themselves in defining their life courses and finding and working on attachments that they require and need. So none of this is now prefigured and given.
By the
This
groups
is
that
by
we
the
belong.
groups and the larger social. This is something that individuals have to
Figure out and
Have to
negotiate
work
as
on.
they go along.
Right. Now, how we are using it is the recognition that if you look at the question, is Caribbean society collectivist or individualist? You find that the research will show that we're somewhere in between, part collectivist, part individualist.
That's in reference to the Hofstede study.
Well,
in general.
in part reference to the Hofstede.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But the argument is that in Caribbean society, very often the process of development involved the disruption of group life. And individuals had to therefore existentially depend on themselves. So that we have, as part of the way we have developed our own resilience, a very strong sense of individuation. Right? So that is the way in which we are talking about the individualization. That individuals have a sense of self, a sense of dependence on self, and they have either a suspicion of groups or uncertainty about which groups they can use to anchor themselves. Right? So that for us, individualization has been going on before the so-called late modern period. We are saying that in Caribbean society, existentially, this process of individualization has gone on for a long time. And it provides a challenge and an opportunity for organizational theory. Because people are going to come into the organization, right, with a distrust or uncertainty about how much they can commit to the organization, how much they can anchor themselves in the organization. And organizations are going to have a challenge to balance between this individualization and, if you like, the collectivization.
All right, so, because what we know from our studies of the post-colonial and our histories as a Caribbean people, one of the fundamental groups to which people belong, the family, was never a very strong group given our history. We know that as, you know, in our colonial times as slaves, families were dismantled. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I learned that as late as the 1950s, you know, men were not, well, children were not allowed or were not expected to use the term father to you know, or dad, and that's as late as the 1950s. So this notion of a family for this group, our group, which is a fundamental referent group, has never ever taken form in the way that it should. Hence, the importance of this concept for us as we're trying to understand ourselves as a people. So I thought, I would, share that as a family, as an important group, and how the breakdown, well, I can't even say the breakdown since we've never had, a structure where that is concerned. It is definitely one of the areas that is heavily being studied in social science theory from a range of different disciplines. And so this is why this is an important concept for us. And as I say, it links to what we're doing, our broader picture of trying to understand the post-colonial.
Right, so that you're mentioning at a sentimental level, people have very strong family identities. But at a structural level, what is the family is very fluid and varied. And this is what we try to communicate, that in a way, this individualization process has started quite early. When people are caught somewhere between the individual, the lone individual on the other hand, and the collective group on the other hand. But in addition to that, the whole notion of the plural Creole complex also suggests that the society is in a state of constant cultural uncertainty and flux. And this creates problems with the identification process. And it again throws back the onus more and more on individuals choosing a pathway and working, negotiating what kinds of attachments they can best work with.
Interesting, because I'm thinking about Hofstad's study again on cultures. And of course his study was carried out in organizations. And one of the variables was the uncertainty avoidance. And our society, Jamaica was a part of that study. And the findings were that we embrace uncertainty. This is a society that that were ranked, I think, very low in uncertainty avoidance. So I think, all of what we're learning in organizational behavior kind of comes back to these concepts that we're talking about.
Well, next we come to your concept, which is working identity. And basically we use the identity concept for a number of reasons. We use it to help us to link the psychological, the individual, and the social group, so that identity is a concept that can be applied at the individual level and at many different social levels, and it can also be a concept applied to link these different levels together. So it is a dynamic and complex concept by itself, and this is one of the reasons why we talk about a working identity, because the notion of the changing same that Gilroy puts in the literature applies to identity. So at one level, identity is very stable and emerges and
over
changes
time,
very slowly in the long term. At another level, identity shifts continually
based on situations.
on a minute by minute basis as we deal with the situations, and we make different aspects of our identity salient or not. We feel good or bad, depending on how that that goes, right?
So,
But that, so that there are lots of interesting methodological problems that there is, because the researcher is asking people to reflect back about their stable identity.
who
right?
are you? So identity in general answers the question, who am I? And it's stable in the sense that I am the same person yesterday as I am today, and I will be tomorrow. And I have that sense of self. This is who I am. But at the same time,
The change in
as
self.
I've thrown into various situations, I have to deploy, various aspects of me in order to negotiate certain situations. The methodological issue is, as we reflect and ask ourselves, as who am I? How do we perceive this? How do we come up? Is it a fictional notion of who I am based on who I would like to be, or
Right, so that the working identity is a concept that we're paralleling to the working self-concept. Right?
Yes.
And so that there is a core, as I say, there is a core, but situationally, there all of this dynamism and variation. And the situational circumstances define what is relevant and what aspect of my identity I bring into play, and so on and so forth, and how that might reflect back on. But most of us,
the core.
right, but most of us are not, as we go about these daily adjustments, thinking about the core. We just spontaneously responding to
The situations that
and
present
maybe at
themselves.
night when we reflect on, like, we might reevaluate and we might feel, this really hurt me to the core, and it might shift. But those changes are long-term changes, and the day-to-day, minute-by-minute changes is sometimes a quite different reality. And as you say, it might be quite fictional, right? Because it is situational. It depends on what is going on at the particular moment, and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a complex business, and there are multiple dynamics that you are dealing with, multiple dialectics when you are dealing with the identity concept. But we want, even as we mention the working identity, we want to maintain a much richer notion of identity that brings in the psychological, the personal, the situational, the social. All of that is available to the individual, and is going to be more or less relevant depending on the questions we're asking and what we're looking for. So we want the students to have a very rich notion of identity, even as we recognize that for most occasions, the situational or working identity is what is at play, and that doesn't tell you
About
whether or not that person is going to go home and commit suicide.
it doesn't tell you about the core. No.
It doesn't tell you about.
It doesn't get to
It
that.
doesn't tell you about the core, and the core accumulates over time, and the crises of the core, happen in a rhythm that might be quite different from
You're
the
making
rhythm.
glimpses of the crisis of the core.
Right, the
in the
rhythm of everyday
situation.
life,
Yeah.
So lots of people, as you know, lots of people who have deep psychological issues can fool everybody about them, because in terms of their working identity, they could to sometimes put aside
all of that,
these issues until
and they're
then.
composed,
Right.
you know.
And
They
so,
manage a situation extremely well,
exactly, you know.
and then tomorrow you hear,
They
oh,
can,
this
they
person
can,
did this. It's like,
not only they can fool their bosses, but in the old days this was less important. Fooling the bosses now is more important because they might take up an M16, you know, one morning at work, right, and start shooting. And this is what part of the issue of terrorism.
yeah.
You know, it is very difficult to decide who is
Who
a
is
terrorist.
And people go, oh, I never see that coming.
Right, you never see
You are
because
such a good person.
what we see is a working identity. And when you're doing the research, we don't want the researcher simply to stay at the level
Of the working
of the
identity.
working identity. It's useful, but not enough. One of the things that we argue for, right, is an integration of the old Ericksonian identity theories, right? James Marcia and Schwartz and so on, they tried, and the sociological and political theory, so that you get that richness of all of the dynamic. And this is important too, because as we said, one of the things about the post-colonial relates to the other that is within,
Yeah.
and the internal conflicts we have, because we have introjected so much of the negatives. We interject our own negations, and we have to struggle with
To
that.
deal with those. Should we talk about emotional power on the heel of that?
Okay, before we get to
Yeah.
emotional power, right? I think we need to mention the forms of informality, right? And you have it, you run out? The forms of informality. Because we've been working with 4 different traditions on informality. And we're trying to say 2 things. One is, those traditions all refer to a great deal of what happens in Caribbean society. And secondly, those traditions relate to each other and operate within organizations. And the 4 traditions on informality that we work with is 1, economic informality, that deals with all of these micro and small organizations as well. And then we have structural or community informality that deals with all the informal settlements and the issues on regulations that relate to both economic informality and the question of informal settlement. And then we have cultural informality that relates to in-process creolization and bricolage, bringing different pieces together and making a pattern, somehow trying to reconstruct the fragments. And then finally, we have psychological informality. And in psychological informality, we have identified 7 features of the psychological informality: individualism, personalism, spontaneity, impulsiveness, preference for transience over institutional stability, expressiveness, interpersonal or interactional gratification, and liminal flexibility. So all of those go into psychological informality. And the psychological informality tradition is a part of organizational study because it is about the informal organization in the bureaucracy and so on. So we have all of those types of informality, and all of those different elements. So that you might see that all that we are saying sorts of dovetail together, right? And that takes us to the question of emotional power, right? And the question of emotional power. Right? What we're saying, right? And here, I think we start with Michael Mann, the sources of social power, right? So that in the discussion on the sources of social power, Mann makes a distinction between distributional power and collective power. So distributional power relates to
kind of zero sum.
right, it relates to hierarchies, and so those at the top get more, and those at the bottom
Get none.
get less.
Very little.
Right?
Very little.
As you say, distributional power is more zero sum. I win, you lose.
lose.
But all organizations and social structures have to have,
Collective.
for reasons of efficiency and coordination, you have to have some system of distributive power, right? But there is not only distributive power, there's also collective power. In collective power, we move from win-lose to
Win-win.
win-win, right? And collective power is a way to balance the problems of distribution of power. And that is where emotional power comes in. So emotional power is not simply about power in the distributional order. And there's power in the distributional order. Those who are top feel better, they have emotional gains, those at the bottom feel emotional. But for the thing to hold together, somebody has to pay attention to the integrative emotional mechanisms in which we all can share, identify, and we all come out as,
In what ways do
as winners.
emotional power manifest?
right? So the emotional power that we're talking about emotional power in the distributive sense and in the collective sense. And what I am trying to emphasize is that for organizations to be successful, emotional power in the collective sense have to balance emotional power
In the
in the distributive sense.
Okay.
And the emotional power in the collective sense is defined insofar as we all recognize that we are gaining collectively in this enterprise, right? So that all the activities.
So there is something in it for everybody.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that really came out in my study is the question about what is in this for me. What is in this for me? And it's an important question, again, based on the framework that we're working with, because organizations are designed, or organizations project a kind of shared or collective approach to power. We all gain. I mean, you see it in your salaries, you see it, but that's at that level, at the organizational level, at the level of the spokesperson,
Right.
at the level of
And that
the
is
staff.
still more distributive
Yes.
than
Yes.
collective,
Mm-hmm.
because we all gain, but some gain much more than
Than
others.
others.
Whereas
But-
collective power,
Yeah.
right? So that the smallest person in the organization can gain as much as the biggest person in the organization. That is how the balance
Is it a gain though, by feeling that just by being a member of this organization, I feel good about myself? Is
that
it
is
that
part
kind
of it. That is part of it,
gain?
right?
Mhm.
But it has to attend to the other issue we're making about emotional gains and losses. So that just as when we're talking about working identity, when you go through life on a day-to-day basis in the organization, right, you have to accumulate more emotional gains than emotional losses, right? So that not only do you share in this larger identity, but you also have to share in your relationship with workmates. You have to share in your environment, right? You have to share in the consideration that people give to your community and so on. So it's a much more challenging and larger issue, because at the end of the day, you also have to measure it in terms of, after today's work, what is my balance between emotional gains and losses, right? Of all the encounters I've had in the workplace, all my situations in the workplace, have I ended up with more gains than...
I'm sure part of this is based on, one's interpersonal encounter, the interpersonal climate of the company.
All of that works. All of that. You see, he's waving at us now. Bye-bye.